Welcome to Conversations with Writers. I'm Andy, I'm a writer, and this is an educational YouTube series meant to catalog writing strategies and philosophies through conversations with other writers. Camille-Yvette Welsch is a teaching professor of English at the Pennsylvania State University, where she directs the High School Writing Day, a one-day conference dedicated to introducing students across Pennsylvania to the study of English at the collegiate level. Twice nominated for a Pushcart, she is the author of Full and the Four Ugliest Children in Christendom. Her work has also been published in The Writer's Chronicle, The Women's Review of Books, Borough Street, Mid-American Review, Indiana Review, Split Lip, Menacing Hedge, Zone 3, Cream City Review, Fledgling Rag, Radar Poetry Magazine, among other venues. She served as the reviews editor for Literary Mama for 5 years, and she has worked with Poems for Life for the past 5 years, a project that pairs poets with residents of Juniper Hill, a local retirement and assisted living community, to write poems about their lives. She also hosts Pub Lit, a monthly literary lecture series at Big Springs Distillery in Bellefonte, PA. She lives in State College with her husband and 2 children who are both hard at work on their own book series. And this is my conversation with Camille. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, it's been a 24 hours.
What are you working on now, and what motivated the project?
Okay, so I'm working on kind of 2 things. I'm working on a long-standing project. So a few years ago, Nicole Miyashiro, who's a poet in State College, had asked me to be a part of an ekphrastic poetry reading. And I was like, oh, sure. And then I was like, oh, I have no ekphrastic poetry. But that's okay, because I like it when people are like, hey, do this thing, because then I have to do the thing. And because, like many people, I'm, pretty busy. Sometimes getting a push is really useful. So I set about finding things that I could respond to, and then discovered that maybe I was not the best ekphrastic writer out there. In part because I think, so ekphrastic writing responds to art, as you probably know. But what I was finding was that when I was responding to paintings, I found that paintings, for me, feel very complete. Like the story's told, and I didn't have a way to get in. It wasn't something where I found myself just with not even a loophole, but just like, the secret door. It just wasn't there for me. And then I found an artist named Nicholas Bruno, who does these really sort of surreal photographs about sleep paralysis, which is a subject that I find really compelling anyway. This idea that your consciousness is completely awake and your body unable to move, and how terrifying that would be. I mean, because of course your mind is limitless, but then, your flesh suit can't go with you. I'm like, what happens then? And there had always been images of that. There's the famous painting where there's like the little devil gargoyle sitting on the woman's chest and she can't move. And so, kind of in modern life, it almost mimics anxiety in lots of ways. And it just had there's so much shadow imagery in it, and so much anxiety, but also so much portent. And they were so vivid. And I found there was story there. Like there was lots of story that I could find and work my way into, and tone and voice, even before I, tried to figure out what exactly was being said. And that just accumulation of detail, even without assuming any kind of story, was going to lead me somewhere. And so I did a number of poems about these photographs that I had seen. And then, we plunged into quarantine, and that too had the same sort of surreal, where your mind is free, but your body is very much trapped in time and place. And so I find that when I'm going back to revise them, my understanding of them is evolving and changing. And so that project's been really interesting for me. And every time I read the poems, I'm kind of like, oh, well, maybe, this is something else. And so that, that's something I'm working on. And then the other thing for me is, and my son's very open about this. So my son is 12 and a half. And last year, he was diagnosed with high functioning autism. And, he's the same kid he always was. But now my understanding of some of his quirks is a little bit greater. And so I find myself writing about him. And it's interesting because the two of us together, I have some sensory processing issues, particularly related to sound. And he has some stimming issues that are sound. And so it's, we're kind of walking around each other, but it's also, thinking about, again, sort of being at odds with your body. And we were walking at the Arboretum one day, and it was, they had done this whole field of daffodils, and in the middle was this like really stubborn tulip that was just gonna be there. And Sam and I both love tulips. And they had planted tulips in the past, and that was sort of what we had hoped for. And it was like, this tulip would just not be brought down. Like, it was just gonna be there. And, we were both pretty pleased with the tulip's existence. But I kind of feel like, that's Sam living his life. He is just gonna be that tulip in that field of daffodils, and that's just how it's going to be. So sometimes there are moments where he's just living his best life, and that's the asthma isn't acting up, the sound isn't bothering him, the world is neither too hot nor too cold. There's so much of these little discomforts that creep and build so often, and you can see them. And then there are other times where he's just fighting. He's in a corner and he's fighting all the time. And so watching him, I think in some ways it's there are things I can't say to him directly, but there are ways to empathize with him maybe on the page, or to better understand him on the page. And that's what I find myself doing. And what's interesting too is he likes the poems. So like I think he likes being seen. And we also have writing hour together. So like we go out, and he's something like 1,400 pages into his book series about sentient stuffed animals who are like taking over the universe. But so that's something we share too. And I think he likes that he shows up in my writing, that it's very validating for him too. So those are the things that I'm kind of working on.
What have you learned about yourself through writing?
That's a really big question. I mean, I think you keep learning about yourself. I mean, I learned that I want to be done. Like, I learned that I wasn't a fiction writer, because I was like, oh, this business is really long. Like, I can't be doing this business, because I really like starting at the moment itself. I don't like winding my way to it. I don't like building up infrastructure for it. Like, I want to get there. This is similar to how I hike and canoe. Like, you don't ever want to canoe with me, because I'm like, what's the destination? And people are like, relax, woman. Like, it's supposed to be relaxing. But that's not how I roll. Like, it's like, that's just not how I roll. And so for poetry, for me, makes a lot of sense, because it's very direct, and I am too. But having said that, I am also someone who I like to return to things. And so I like projects. Like, I do like where I can be kind of walking down the street and thinking about whatever it is that I'm working on, and returning to it. I've also come to the realization, this sounds stupid, but like I've ended up writing really political poems, which I didn't expect. And I was certainly never a person without opinion, but I'm kind of showing up at rallies and things like that in reading poems, which is not necessarily something I expected, but it has become, a part of my life and who I am. And so in that way, writing's changed me. It's really brought that to the fore. And I just think you constantly think about what resonates with you. And I guess also, and this may be part being a teacher too, like I'm a pusher. Like I can't go into the bookstore and if someone pulls something unfortunate off the shelf, I'm like, maybe like you should try X instead of that. Like, you know what I mean? And I'm like, this poem could be a gateway drug. Like, let's just try it. Like, let's see what you think of this instead of that, and I've got my mother reading poetry. She's making her book group read poetry. I'm here for that because I think, people can be brought in. You just have to figure out how. And writing has always been a way. I mean, yes, it helps you express your thoughts, but even more, it's it's almost like swimming, right? You dive in and you can stay under, and then when you come out, you're refreshed and you're almost like you don't even know how long you've been under. You know what I mean? When you really get immersed in a project. And that's a really exciting feeling. And then there's also these moments, and this, I don't know if this will sound egomaniacal or not, but other people have this too, I'm sure, where you read something you've written like weeks or months or even years later, and you're like, I'm good at this. Like I'm good at this. And I think that's good. Like you should have moments where you're like, damn, like I am really good at something. And that was, I don't have that every moment, but there's certainly, yeah. And then there are moments where you're like, I'm bad at this. But you have moments where you see growth, which is really cool. Like where you can see that you've grown as a writer, and moments too, where you're like, okay, like that was good in that moment, but I can see that I've like leveled up. And so it's also something that, and I've thought about this too as I aged, I think everybody has something, whether they're striving because they're like running their 5Ks or marathons or whatever, you have something that you keep going back to where you are measuring your growth as you age, and you're thinking about, what am I doing to get better, to improve myself? And, whether it's an art or a craft or something with your body or whatever it is, but you are measuring your growth as a human being. And so I think writing also gives me that.
What's the role or responsibility of writing for you? What keeps you generating material? Why write?
Donald Trump was elected. No. I'm only half kidding. So, I mean, yeah, I'm only half kidding. I mean, really, as I said, I find myself growing. I don't even know that I want to call it political, because it's not even political. It's like human. Osaze Osage was my student. You know what I mean? Like, you get the University Park alerts are all sexual assault. I had a student who had to be escorted to class because she had been assaulted and she was terrified to walk alone. I had another student who, when I spoke to her, I had to make sure that her back was against a wall or a building because she was too terrified that someone would come up behind her. Like, that's part of the reason I write, is because, every single semester, students come out to me either, because of their sexuality or because of something from their background. They were abused or assaulted, or they came from poverty, or they're first generation, and they want things for themselves, but not just themselves. Like, they want to make of themselves for their families, to overcome their history, right? So I don't think you can ignore that. Like, and again, I don't think that's political. I think that's human. Like, that's, and so in part, I think so much of the psychic space that we inhabit as writers, we also inhabit as teachers. And in my case, and in the case of many other people, either as parents or caregivers in the world, Um, I think all of that is coming from the same space. And if you're ignoring those things, and not even ignoring, but if you're trying not to see them, is that different? I don't know. But sometimes I think for your own mental health, you're like, I can't look in that direction. But on the other hand, I'm like, we have to look history in the face as it happens. There's no way to not do that. Then I think you're writing about it, and then sometimes, I feel like I look like a fool because I went to the politics and poetry reading, and I have a poem called American Mother, and it's about George Floyd. And I almost always cry when I read it. And I feel like a tool because I'm like, I'm the person whose own poetry makes them cry. Like how how self-indulgent is that? But it's not my poetry that makes me cry. It's the idea of how amazingly we have failed this man and other men and boys like him, but I just think that's the space, like that's what we need to do. And sometimes you come at it by writing about nature, and sometimes you come at it very directly by writing about George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or whomever, but we're still writing about humanity and what we owe each other and what we deserve. And so I think that is the role of writing. I mean, that is what we're writing about, is this kind of shared humanity and interdependence on each other. Yeah. And so even when I'm saying like, don't read that, read this, it's because it's like the world, it's another way of saying the world can be beautiful. Or as Maggie Smith, says, it's like, it's good bones, look what we could do. I think it's all born of that same impulse.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that this is a space where we can begin to create a community and acknowledge our own shortcomings as humans, as a collective. And then maybe once we acknowledge those issues, we can start moving toward fixing them.
Yeah.
When you're struggling to write for whatever reason, what strategies do you use to get yourself to the page?
When I'm struggling to write, so what I used to do when I was young and less kind to myself, I'd be like, damn it, write, just sit there. But I don't have time for that sort of business anymore. So what I do now is two things. And so I can never get away from books because that is still like my central, look behind me. Like that is still my central love. So I've switched it up a little bit. Now I just switch arts. I move over to the visual arts. And so I like collage a lot. And because it's a similar process, but because I work with words as in so much of my life, because as you know, I'm a teacher, and so I'm reading constantly. But with collage, like I can just look at image and color and literally manipulate it on the page. And so if you ever collage with me, you're like, that woman's not doing anything. Yeah, I'm just like moving stuff around. And I have it categorized. One part of what I have is like a big folder where I have everything based on color. I will cut things out for hours and just tuck them in folders based on color. And then I can just spill the color out in front of me and move things around. But in a way, so it kind of calms my brain a little bit and gets me back focused on image. But it also has me thinking in images and colors and juxtaposition in a way that I need kind of for poetry. And then when I start to put them together on the page, I am thinking about how they're interrelated. I am thinking about how narrative begins to happen by proximity. So like a lot of the things that happen, contrast, repetition, alignment, proximity, all of those central tenets of design move right over to poetry very directly. And so I think that for me works pretty well. And then I also just intensely love color and texture. And so it's very sensory, very tactile. And again, it kind of moves you right along into what you would need for writing. And it brings you into that kind of meditative space where you're quieting down the other voices. So that works for me. The other thing that I do is so when I was an undergrad, I worked for the Aurelia Press, which is a fine arts press out of Westchester University, and they make books by hand. And when I say by hand, I mean for serious. Like, we picked up the type and loaded it into the composing stick. If you wanted, words separated, you used a brass or a copper to do it. And then, you locked it down with wood blocks on the press. We used a Vandercock press. And so, like, Gutenberg would have been fairly familiar with the process we used. Like, that's how. And then we did like a simple stitch binding for chapbooks. And so, that's where I started. But then I got a little more advanced and started doing all kinds of different stitch bindings. And then I went to Wicked and Craig and got myself a lot of leather. And now I'm trying leather bindings. But it's more just that infatuation with book as physical object, and thinking about kind of the entire process. But even when you're using a composing stick, you're thinking, what's great? Short lines, because this composing stick is really heavy. So it changes, even that changes the way you think about how you're creating poetry and how you're creating a line, and the impact of it and the impact of spacing and how it appears on the page. And so I would say each of those things kind of informs my writing in different ways and gets me ready in different ways. But most of it is kind of quieting the brain, just quieting your brain down and not having interference from, like, I love TV, but it's kind of pedestrian, like, in terms of the ideas you're going to get. Whereas what you can put together with collage is totally different. And then also, I think you just get synapses firing the second you learn something new. Like, because I am learning how to do the leather binding, but I'm also like, okay, I need a new tool to do that. So I'm going to have you hold for 1 second because I want to show you something. So my dad is a master builder, and he made me, this is a threader for bookbinding. You can probably see that it's insanely beautiful. Like, when I decided that I was interested in bookbinding, I got my dad a book on bookbinding so that he could sort of read about it with me. And it said, well, you need such and such tools. So my dad went through and made me every single tool that I would need out of like an assortment of really beautiful woods, so that I would have these tools forever to make books with. And so that's another element of it too, is that, I've got my family kind of in the tools that I'm using, and it's something tactile. It's this apprenticeship that I'll be carrying on from literally generations of people. But now that I'm working with the leather, I'm like, Dad, I need these other tools. He's gonna be like, really?
What revision strategy or strategies do you find most useful when revising your own work, and why? What sort of problems or challenges do these activities help you solve?
I revise a little bit as I go, then I put it in the drawer for a while, then I come back and revise again. If I'm working with like a larger project, then I'm asking questions about how they're interacting with each other, what kind of information has been left out, like what information needs to be included. So sometimes that'll help me figure out if a poem needs to be written to fill in an information gap. And so my first two books are project books, and because they have very specific purposes and narratives, that was so much easier to revise, I will say, because I knew, like, okay, this is exactly what I want to do. This is what people need to know. These are the primary characters. And so in some ways it was a lot like revising fiction, and that was so much more pointed. You know what I mean? It was so much more focused. looking now at starting to put a third collection together, it's so much harder. Oh my God. I'm like, this is just like, it's just like buckshot. I have no idea what the through line is. I feel like, I'm one of those ancient Greeks looking at the sky and I'm just like, yeah, those stars that's an archer. All right. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what the rhyme or reason is. So like I'm reading books on this because I literally, and I've heard a lot of theories, but I'm still struggling with how to put those together. But for revision, sometimes it's really dependent on the poem and whether it exists in a series too. Like sometimes I'll be like, I know what the idea is, and I'll just put the other poem away and I'll just completely rewrite it so that it's an entirely new voice. Sometimes I'll steal a line or two and I'll write from there. Sometimes I'll break it up into additional poems because I'll feel like, well, this needed to be explored further, or I want to go maybe in a couple of different directions and see what happens. I don't have any standard revision procedure. I'm not in any way a methodical person. And so, in some ways I wish I was. I have a friend who's a writer and she has like this accordion folder, and in each thing she has like every revision of each poem and they're tacked to each other. And I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. And I feel like I'm like Pigpen whirling in with my like, dustbin of drafts that I can maybe find in my hard drive. Like part of me wishes I could be her, but it's just sort of not in my DNA. So I am much more haphazard about it. But I am someone who's like cognizant of the sand in my shoe. And so I'm like, this isn't right. And I'll just kind of keep working at it because it's not right. But it is not something that has any method, any rhyme or reason other than like it just keeps irking me. And so I'll go back and I'll smooth the line or I'll re-say it. Or I think the advice that has stuck with me the most is actually from Richard Hugo. I guess I think he said in Triggering Town, he had a clothesline or something where he could put up his poems in his office, and if he could stand to look at them it was a certain time period, I don't remember what it was, but if he could stand to look at them for that time period and not be compelled to change something, he knew they were done. And I feel like I'm kind of similar. It's like, okay, if that one thing doesn't stick in my craw for X number of days, then it's probably done. And that seems right to me. And like I said, it's not methodical or scientific. It's just sort of a feeling that I have, like sand in the oyster. And then I'm like, and then it's a pearl. Except it's not. It's just like goes back to being a normal oyster. It's like that's all I'm looking for.
What is your favorite part of the writing process and why?
I like almost all of it. I like coming up with a new idea. I guess I don't like the beginning when I'm sort of, dicking around and I'm not getting anything done. And I write like my gateway poem that I hate, but I need to get out so that I can get to the actual thing. Like that's kind of annoying. And I don't know if other people do that, but I usually, when I sit down, I write like something crappy. Billy Collins says something like, you should write for 21 minutes every day. It's like 20 minutes to get the crap out. And then like in minute 21, you'll probably come up with something good. And if you don't, you should stop. And I was like, okay, that seems right. And so I do that. Like I'll write to get the crap out, and I know it has to happen, and I know I have to write through it. And I hate that part. But then once I get into what I'm actually writing and I come upon a problem that's interesting and really engaging, that's what I like about it. And you're trying stuff out, and you're in your own little sandbox figuring out how the next thing is going to go. And that's really exciting. And then when I was working on The Four Ugliest Children, what was fun about that was I had to keep imagining them in different places and what they would do next. And so it was fun to just be like driving in the car or in the shower or walking down the street or whatever, and to be able to think about these characters and what you do with them next, instead of being like, oh, I have to get, milk at the grocery store. I was like, this is such a better way to walk down the street and think about things than to obsess about, your uncompleted chores. So that I really liked. I like that about the writing process. Like, that's really enjoyable. It's not, it's not necessarily when it's done or when you read it or any of that. It's kind of working through those problems. And I think that's one of the things that makes, writers and artists interesting people, is because we create our own problems to solve. Do you know what I mean? I don't think other disciplines do that. I think they solve problems, but they don't create their own problems that they then solve. Like, I think that's a unique mindset that does that. And so, like, they're always sort of interesting people to be around, because you're like, what should we do today? And then they're like, well, I have an idea. And you're like, okay. And it creates something interesting.
That's such an honest answer. And I had a moment of my own self-realization right then when you said that writers create their own problems to solve them. So if you find yourself creating problems for yourself, maybe you're a writer, and we can put those ambitions or those tendencies to something more productive like publication, and then they actually matter.
Yeah. Or you could create games. I mean, like, it is a creative process. Like, and I think too, because so my brother, he has his MFA in fiction, right? And he's a vice president at Duquesne, and people are like, wait, that's your degree? And he's like, yeah, like, what do you think we do? Like, we work collaboratively. We know how to take critique and immediately implement it. Like, we know how to not only solve the problem someone hands us, but how to, like, find the problem and solve it. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what writers do. That's why you're successful in this position.
What reading suggestions do you have? What sort of authors do you keep in your back pocket?
Well, judging by my bookshelf, I keep all the authors in my back pocket. So this is an interesting question, because I read a lot. I come back to certain people. There's one book that I just love for its weirdness. It's called Paper Doll Fetus by Cynthia Marie Hoffman. And it's got a lot of the history of obstetrics, which is some crazy business. We just read it in my 213 class, and my students, we only had one man come to that class, and he was like growing paler by the minute. But it's fascinating. Like the calcified babies, like that. There was one that was like 20 pounds, and they extracted it after the mother died. But she was like 70. She lived with it, for decades. Still, yeah, I mean, it's nuts. The whole book is fascinating, like this fascinating history that takes on the science. One is told from the point of view of a twin who's absorbed by the other twin in the womb. Like, it's really, really fascinating, and kind of a masterclass in taking on unusual personas, because it's also the lamb's wool that's used on the manacle that the woman is shackled to as she gives birth. And you're like, God, this is fascinating. So Cynthia Marie Hoffman does really interesting project books. Lynn Emanuel, another one who I'm like, what is she doing? But I'm so happy to be along for the ride. Like, she got me in with her, like, I think it's an ode to Gertrude Stein, and it was hilarious. And I was like, so rarely do people use humor in poetry, and her humor is so sly and so funny. So I loved her. And then Louise Glick, I read The Wild Iris, and I was like, this is amazing. And then the more that I got to know it, the more impressed I was. So I had a landscaper. This is so random. I taught the book, but I had a landscaper come in to talk about the seasonal cycles, like, and the plants, and why the exact language was appropriate to what was because it's amazing. Like, it's amazing how it works, like on the religious level, on the landscaping level, on the, you know, the lyrical word level. It was so much. They're so stark and fit, like they're physically fit poems, you know what I mean? They're just the tensile strength is nuts. But and like the humanity of Richard Hugo letter poems, you know, Letter to Kathy from Wisdom, when the sucker lights go on in their eyes. Like, I will never not love that poem. There's something so just compassionate about that poem, you know, so empathetic. I love that poem. Philip Levine, like Philip Levine was another one who okay, I'll probably get thrown out of like the poetry land, but I don't like Wordsworth. Like, I don't have time for that bullshit. Like, I don't run around looking at daffodils. I want the tulip. But you know what I mean? I'm like, that was never my jam. You know, there's Philip Levine, who's like, we're waiting in a long line at the Ford Highland Park for work. You know what work is. You may not do it, but if you're old enough to read this, you know what work is. Forget you, you know? And I'm like, that voice, that anger, I was like, this is amazing. And yet it's also the man who writes The Simple Truth, you know, Onions and Potatoes, like that simple truth of, you know, people who've gathered food and you eat it together. And that, you know, that is Philip Levine's another one who that simple working class truth was so powerful. So, I mean, when I first got into poetry, my professor loved Philip Levine, loved Richard Hugo, loved Bill Matthews. And so that's kind of who I started with. Phil Levine was his teacher, and that was who he really loved. And so I came to sort of some of the women that I loved a little bit later. Oh, the other person he introduced me to who changed how I thought about poetry too was Larry Levis. Larry Levis, he got from point A to point Z, and you're like, what happened? I mean, he could make jumps and weave like 4 narratives together, and at the end you were like, wow, I mean, that's amazing. I mean, when you read Anthony Doerr's what is it, that cuckoo, I can't remember exactly what it's called. Oh, the Cloud Cuckoo Land, sorry, it's on the shelf. And he has all of those different timelines threading through. I mean, Larry Levis does that in like a 7-page poem. And I was like, how does he do this? And so he was someone who, you know, when students are trying to do something really complex and they want to weave in a number of different stories, Larry Levis is who I hand over. I'm like, Caravaggio, Swirl and Vortex, take it on, you know, start here. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just amazing. And then I guess also I keep coming back to Elizabeth Bishop, because so many poets kind of stick to the same thing. They keep doing the same thing. And then Elizabeth Bishop never did. She reinvented herself in like every poem, which, I mean, that's amazing. I mean, you read her poems over again and you think, oh my God, I mean, I could go back over her poems again and again and again, just clarity of voice and detail and mastery of form. And I also love that if you look at the beginning of one art, you know, when you look at the original drafts, you're like, I would not have rewritten this poem. I would have been like, this is terrible. I'm not rewriting it. And then, you know, and then it becomes one of the most famous villanelles in the English language. And so I love to show students her revisions, actually, because you can say it doesn't have to be great the first time. You can come from what is arguably dross and make it into something amazing. You have to know where you're headed. And she somehow always did. The Mothman, still a favorite of mine. You know, a misprint can lead to so much. So, yeah, I mean, I could keep going, but I feel like I'll take up the rest of your life.
So many of those authors are my own influences too, especially Bill Levine. And what work is so important. And to me, it's even, there's a love poem aspect to it. Because one of the things that it's so difficult is to share that emotion, right? Is to get beyond that, the masculine stereotype, to actually express, familial love. And to me, that's, he is working class. And that is a lot of my poetry. That's where I come from. That's, rural Appalachia. And so that's the voice I kind of represent.
Oh, this is awesome. Have you read Joseph Millar?
I haven't.
So he's married to Dorianne Lau, who I also love, but he wrote Overtime, and he's another kind of working class poet, and his work is great, also great. But it has, and B.H. Fairchild. Have you read B.H. Fairchild?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, The Art of the Lathe. Get thee to a bookstore. The Art of the Lathe. Just look up. Is it called Heart and Soul? Okay, I won't try to look through my bookshelf, but I think it's called Heart and Soul, B.H. Fairchild. He was his dad was a machinist, and he grew up completely working class, but it is the most beautiful book about masculinity without all the toxic bullshit, about like working class masculinity. Andy, it is so good. Absolutely read that book.
That will be my next purchase.
Okay, awesome. Are you still teaching?
Nope, I'm done. I quit.
Oh, all right. Well, more power to you. What are you up to these days?
Writing nearly every day.
Oh my God. Living the dream. Congratulations, lady.
I am, and I'm trying not to feel guilty about it.
You don't have to feel guilty about that.
But I'm still like sending out applications and trying to find a job that's not teaching, that doesn't have a grading mountain, because that is painful.
Yeah.
Since I'm not thinking about grading constantly, I have 3 book projects in my head.
Oh my God.
I didn't know they were there until I could think about something else.
Yeah, I feel you.
That was one of my big fears. Like, if I left academia, would I still be writing? Because I thought that was the thing that kept me writing. It turns out that was the thing that was sort of like preventing the writing.
Yeah.
And I was worried that I wouldn't learn anymore. That's so not been the case. Like, I have been researching all kinds of stuff, and since Phil is still teaching, I still have access to all the fancy databases, so I can just read whatever, whenever.
Yeah.
I'm not drawing a paycheck right now, but my anxiety is not as bad.
Yeah, Cindy Clem did something similar. Like, it was driving her nuts. So she went to the writing center, and then it was like, still not far enough. And then she left, and she got her license in Reiki, and then she started teaching yoga, and she writes for, is it St. Joseph's or St. John's? It's a rehab facility that's like 20 or 30 minutes outside of State College that she writes for. And she's like, I call it, it's like the Botox retirement. It's like she left, and all of a sudden, like, no lines. It's like, yeah, it's a whole new woman.
And that's what I've been noticing with people that have left. They look younger and happier and healthier.
Yeah. When
I was talking to everybody, the people who have like tenure track positions and are tenured, their salaries, especially if they're at a small liberal arts school, their top dog salaries are entry level salaries in like full-time writing and editing positions outside academia. And I was like, I could have that. I could get, double what I'm paid currently and do a third of the labor.
Yeah. It's frustrating because it's like it's all those jobs that help people. They don't pay money. Where it's like, we want you to help people and it's good for your soul, allegedly, but we're not gonna pay you for that shit. Like, that's not how this is gonna work. I said to my husband, I'm like, play the Powerball. If I win, I'm going to like fund the Racial Justice Center, but I'm going to call it the Adjunct Faculty Racial Justice Center. Yeah, I really need to win the lottery. That'd be so awesome. I won the payback lottery, and now to spread it around.
And I think that's the impulse, right? When we have nothing, we're like, okay, we don't want anybody else to suffer as much as we have.
Well, you think that's it until like people are like, I pay back my student loans and everybody else should suffer. And you're like,
I don't understand that. I don't understand that.
I don't either. I'm like, I had student loans. They sucked. I think everybody else should get them paid off. And I'm like, this predatory lending, because I do know people are like, man, pay man. And I'm like, don't you understand this process? It's not like they're paying back the original loan. They're paying it back 2 and 3 times. I'm like, I don't think you should be made rich on the backs of other people. Those loans, or, well, I think other people should suffer because I had to suffer. You're like, that's fucked up. How do you not realize that's fucked up? But apparently people don't realize, because I just, yeah, I don't, I'm at a loss as to how that's how people's brains work. Really. I have to admit, I am the person who watches those shows, like that show, What Would You Do? And I'm like, what is wrong with these people? I'm like, why aren't you intervening? I mean, and a lot of people do, but then there are other people who are like, I don't want to get involved. I'm like, why not? What's wrong with you? Do you have any interest in doing poems from life, which is where you're paired with a senior citizen and like you interview them and then you write a poem about their life?
Ooh, that sounds fun.
It's awesome. Okay, so Nicole's always looking for writers. She also did a project that was, this was an awesome project, actually. So her sister is an ER doctor in New York City, and her sister worked all through COVID. She had a baby, like an under 1 year old baby at the time. And so like they had to make the decision, like, does she stay living at home, you know, with the baby? It was awful. But so there were 10 ER docs. She and her sister created this project. There were 10 ER docs and 10 poets, and we all got paired. And we wrote poems about the docs' experiences during COVID. It was really an amazing experience. Like and they were so different. Like just their takes on it were so different. I worked with her sister, and I have to say her sister's commanding emotion was rage. Like she was so angry, like, you know, so angry. The project is called Frontlines. The main site page is www.frontlinesproject.com. Julia did one. Carolyn Meehan did one. It was really interesting too, because one woman was like, when I'm in my entire PPE, you know, garb, nobody asks me about my race. And she's like, for the first time, I don't have to explain my race or my gender to anybody. I can just do my job. And I was like, whoa.
Wow.
Yeah, the reactions were so interesting. And yeah, it was really interesting. And, you know, her sister said too, like their mental health guy committed suicide. It was a really, really fascinating conversation, you know, and she's like, you have all these people like banging pots and pans at 7, and then they go out to eat and sit, you know, 6 inches or 18 inches away in this like miasma of particles, just droplets going through the air. And we're the heroes, but we're disposable heroes. You're ready to throw us out at any moment. She talks about what she has to do to be able to go inside safely to see her child. And I mean, it was just, yeah, it was an incredible project. Incredible project. Public poetry is my jam. And then poems from life. Like last year, I worked, so I've done this 5 times, I guess. But the last time I did it, the gentleman with whom I worked was in the memory care facility. So he was really hard to work with. He because like he couldn't remember exactly how many kids he had. And so his memory was really spotty. and I had to go back and check things, but I couldn't I couldn't get in touch with his child, so I couldn't talk to her about like what was happening. So he'd worked at Penn State in the 60s. So like I threw a Hail Mary pass and I like started hitting up people in the Earth and Mineral Science department. Cause I was like, I need to know something about mining because I don't know anything about it. And I got a professor of practice because I'm like, I need tactile things. And she was really helpful. And she's like, but I think he worked with this guy. She's like, I've met him at a couple of parties, and I think he worked with this guy, because then he went to University of Alaska. And I was like, okay. So like I hit up this guy who is himself a professor emeritus of Alaska who lives in Texas. So I'm like, whatever. So I'm like cold calling these people like out of nowhere. And I'm like, this is weird, but, and the guy's like, no, it's great. So I had like a Zoom call with this random Indian man that he had worked with 30 years ago, but he was great. Like he remembered specific things. So I took some from him, and then I ended up panning for gold so I could see what that was like. And then Mandy Passmore Ott is fantastic, because I was like, Mandy, have you gone hiking near Williamsport? She's like, yeah. I was like, okay, this is what I need to know. I was like, what are the trees? What is that ecosystem? What does it look like? And I'm like pulling all the stuff, and my dad's a forester. So I was like, okay, these are the trees, Dad. Like, what do they look like? And so it's like gathering information was nuts, because like I'm really coming at it from nowhere, because I have like his professional bio, and then I have these pieces that I'm just trying to put together. And then there's also like just the metaphor of panning for gold. You know, when you're thinking about all that slurry that goes away and these few pieces that stay. And it was like he remembered enough to talk about panning for gold with his children. He remembered that. You know, he remembered going along the creek side. He remembered going into the woods in Williamsport with his dad. And so there's, you know, an immediate metaphor there with those few nuggets that stay and everything else that goes. And so I was like, okay. And then once I had actually, you know, panned for gold, I was like, okay, I know what the process is. And so I could use the metaphor effectively, but it really was like some machinations to get what I needed. But then I worked with this other woman who was a collage artist, actually. And what was funny is I had interviewed her maybe 15 years earlier to do an article for the newspaper on her exhibit. And so we knew each other. And then when I went back in, she had cared for her husband until he finally passed from his illness. And she kind of had, you know, a nervous breakdown. It had been like literally years of, you know, mental, emotional, and physical wear. And the drug that they had put her on instantly kicked the Alzheimer's into overdrive. And then once they took her off the symptoms reversed a little bit, but not completely. And so she was very disoriented in the mornings, and they ended up putting her in memory care. And so she's surrounded by people who have pretty advanced Alzheimer's, while she is very sharp. And she's a woman who has a doctorate and an MFA. So she is this very intelligent woman, very sharp, with absolutely no peers. So there's this profound isolation that she's working from in this facility. She's not allowed to do her collage because she's not allowed sharp things. So it's like these elements that are being taken from her. She listens to NPR so that she can listen to her jazz, because she loves jazz, and she has her books. And so she loves poetry, and she's also often like, she'll simply quote excerpts of things. And so when I was putting the poem together, it was also like collage, because there's like excerpts of the things that she would quote to me, poems that she loved. She also was a thespian. So there's like quotes from plays and things like that. And then there's moments from her collage work that came in. And so it was really fun to put the poem together because it's her voice and my voice, these other voices, plus the images that would come in, in the past and the present that were coming in and overlapping. And then she also said, and it was so funny, when I was talking to her, because a lot of the men that I had spoken with, their lives were their wives. Like, they were so the guiding star of their lives. And then with Alice, it was her mind. She had fought so hard to have an intellectual life that she didn't want to talk about her kids or her husband. I mean, there's no doubt that she loved them, but her fight, her entire life, was to have a life of the mind. And so that is what she wanted to talk about. And that was what came through in the poem. Yeah, I have so enjoyed working on those. I had another woman who I was talking to her and we were sort of talking about, the nice things in life, like, well, this is where we went on vacation. And I asked her about her children. And she said, oh, we had three, however many children. And then she named them, but the names didn't add up to the number she gave me. And I said, wait, did I miss one? And she said, well, Christina died. And I said, I'm sorry. Do you mind if I ask, what had happened? And when the child she wasn't even one yet. And she was sick. They had gotten a babysitter so that they could go get medicine. And the child's fever just like shot up through the spinal fluid and took out her hearing, took out her sight. And it just like burned its way through the baby's brain and left the child in pain for the rest of its life. Christina lived 7 more years, and she had almost constant convulsions, and they couldn't keep the baby. They kept the baby at home trying to care for it, and then it became too much, and they gave it to the care of nuns at a convent, and then that became too much, and then they put her in a home, for children with very severe medical issues. And she talks about this, but she also said, she started to cry, and she said, I'm sorry, I should be over this by now. It's 50 years. And I said, no, I said, grief, you don't get over grief. You carry it, but you don't get over it. There's nothing to get over. And you certainly don't have to apologize. She's your child. She talked about taking her other children to the facility to see their sister. And she said, they didn't like it. But I said, you don't leave a family member in here and not come to see her. And she said, and that's how I raise my children. You don't do something terrible and not face it. And I was, I mean, it's these, you come into these amazing revelations that people trust you with. And I kept saying to her over and over again, like, is this okay? Is this okay that I write about this? Because it was so intense and so personal and intimate. You don't want to take pain like this and exploit it on any level, and yet it was so powerful in how it shaped her and her family in terms of you take responsibility and you acknowledge what your limits are, and she also said, people came to help and then they stopped. And then you're living in a glass house where people can see what you're doing, but they don't ever offer to come in and help. And so I wrote the poem, and then I wasn't able to see her again because of COVID. And then I got an email from her daughter, like a couple months ago. That's like, my mother passed in February. And she said, but I wanted to thank you for the poem. We were all shocked that that's what she had chosen to talk about. She said, she didn't talk about it very much. And she said, I was shocked that you had managed to get the nuance of what had happened. And she said, and it actually opened up conversations with my mom, and we were able to talk about it before she died. It was like, thank you. This was something that happened that was unexpected for us. And so again, like, the public poetry is so different, but I think so important. I think we've kind of relegated poetry to the academy, and it shouldn't be there. I mean, it's nice that it's there, whatever. But I'm like, it does so much more work in so many important ways when you pull it out of there and you put it in the hands of families and people who really need that, and helping people to feel seen, and understood. And so often too, I think with elderly folks, people forget you had a life. Because they infantilize elderly folks. That is not, in some ways, her experience is like one of the most intensely adult human things that has happened. And I also have to say, her husband's like, we should go to therapy. And this, I mean, keep in mind, this is like the 40s that he's like, we need care. And I was like, your husband's amazing. Like, he didn't fit in the poem, but I'm like, your husband's amazing. So, I mean, I know that's off topic, but I just, public poetry is also a big part of, like, if I won that 1.2 billion, I'd be like, public poetry centers going up.
This sounds amazing.
Yeah. So I'll tell Nicole that you're interested.
Totally interested. Now I'm kind of like weeping over the stories. But thank you so much. This has been amazing.
Well, thank you. It was really a pleasure. It was good to talk to you. I'm glad you're doing so well.
Aside from not drawing a paycheck, I'm doing a lot of writing, and I feel good about that.
That is good. And you do look younger.